Alright. Well, Crystal Channel just posted something about Christ consciousness, which is kind of a little what you might call buzzword that the New Age movement seems to use. Let's try and dissect those ideas for a moment. What is Christ? Christ is a word that is made up from in as the English version of other words that have no meaning whatsoever and don't actually apply to the context that we're in right now, and that person who was making that video is likely to be in. It used to mean in Greek, they reckon, to anoint with oil. So we're not seeing the oil. We're not seeing how anything to do with the New Age movement has anything to do with that. We're not seeing how the continued practice of Christianity throughout life for those who do that has anything to do with that. They do, however, at the baptism ritual in Christianity, put a substance called chrism around people's skulls, which is the anointing act. And so that gets washed off within an hour or two because the baby poos their pants. So that doesn't last very long, and so there's that. Outside of that, Christ never existed. The Vatican's had at least since 400 AD to pony up the dough as far as the census records are concerned. As far as we know, Jesus H. Christ never existed, and is a fictional character that refers to some kind of ritualistic account as described in a book that no one ever reads. And so, and also, unless they were from the Protestant Reformation or from the post-King James Anglicans, weren't able to read until the 1960s, thanks to Mass being in Latin. So that's Christ, completely made up. The word consciousness. The word consciousness has multiple definitions. Within the psychological sciences, there are different authors that apply that word differently depending on their circumstances. It often refers to sentience. And so sentience is roughly the idea of a sort of independent intelligence that has its own sense of, that seems to have volition. In that respect, if you apply that to consciousness, then consciousness would be an organic, natural form of intelligence that is not mechanical and does not have a mechanical origin. So artificial intelligence from computers would automatically be ruled out. And robotic intelligence, likewise, it wouldn't actually be consciousness. It could pass a Turing test and potentially appear as sentience, but it would not actually be what consciousness is, because consciousness, even in the psychological sciences, devoid of all spiritual traditions, has multiple definitions for what that word means, and none of it refers to computers or artificial intelligence. It does usually refer to sentience, however, it doesn't necessarily refer to sentience, and because there are multiple authors with multiple definitions, and the list is too long to freaking count, right now, in this short video, it's probably not the time to compare, say, Daniel Dennett with Berkeley or Ibn Sina or whatever. Like, there's just too many authors to go through. And also the issue of on that subject is there are several debates. Usually, it's just so you know, it's between the standard mainstream science is usually between material monism and immaterial dualism. Descartes came from the immaterial dualist camp, which is to say that minds are independent of physical bodies, and whereas the material monists might argue that a mind is it is an emergent property of the body's processes. So those two debates rage on. There is yet another camp called immaterial polydualism, which is the experience of having multiple minds, none of which originate with the physical body, and subsequently are the avatars or not selves in Buddhism. Okay, now that's not necessarily discussed in the mainstream psychological sciences because of their preponderance of psychiatry, which has no genuine interest in the debate about whether or not monism or dualism or immaterial or materiality are the correct answers or not. They don't even have a proper operating definition for mind. To be fair, neither does neurology, neither did Daniel Dennett, neither did Emin Sina, neither did Rene Descartes. Heck, the only person that even came close to that was probably Immanuel Kant, and all they've been doing with science over the last, say, 400 years is proving his treatise correct. And so, that doesn't actually tell you what a mind is. It doesn't tell you what a spirit is. It doesn't tell you what consciousness is. So if you've, by this point, made conflations between mind, spirit, and consciousness, you've done the wrong thing. A mind can be described as completely independent of spirit, completely independent of consciousness, and completely independent of sentience as well. And so in some ways, a mind might be defined as a collection of attitudes and beliefs or feelings that construct a worldview. May or may not include a apprehension of the idea of self or identity, or the lack thereof. Mind is more of an abstract notion that has nothing to do with a material or immaterial substance. In that respect, sometimes the material might look like they're winning because they'll turn around and they say, "Well, it's got nothing to do with that, does it? It's just those abstract notions." And well, the abstract notions are obviously recorded by the physical body through their representation of life, representations of life and lived experiences. So, in other words, the bodies are responsible, which isn't actually necessarily true. There are experiences that people have that are completely independent of material monism and its false tenets. There are also experiences that support material monism as well. And as a consequence, immaterial dualism sounds like it's oversimplistic. You've got a spirit, which is the same as a mind, and if you've got a body, is fairly, and they're not the same thing. They're two different things. It's consistent with Catholic doctrine. It's not consistent with the experiences of many spiritual traditions around the world. It's not necessarily consistent with the facts of how different minds might perceive reality or experience reality, and including people with examples can be shown in people with certain types of conditions. They're actually expressing the idea in many cases, not all of them, the idea that's very similar to immaterial polydualism, and so the idea of avatars in Buddhism can apply. The thing is though is that to measure that specifically in a lab is quite difficult. So they've tried not to do that. They try to avoid anything they can't measure in a lab, so they don't want to talk about it. But in terms of the broader philosophical discussion, it's there. And so when a spiritualist or a so-called hard rusted-on scientist has a conversation about it, they're both actually talking about two completely different things. Okay, spiritualists seem to conflate mind with spirit and spirit with soul and soul with consciousness, or then they have these other terms to say the soul's the small one and spirit's the big one, and the spirit's the higher self and the soul's the lower self. But it's like, well, actually, when you're dealing with avatars, they're not your souls at all. They could be spiritual energies coming from other bodies, or mind coming from other bodies, or whatever. So it really depends on what your definition of each term is. If you think a mind is a energy type, then you're not seeing this necessarily with the same type of abstraction that psychology does. You're seeing it completely differently. And so the idea of mind being the same as spirit or soul isn't accurate in that respect. They're actually two different things. And so consciousness is a little bit more complicated because consciousness might, depending on which author you're talking about, or two, might be referring to a different set of principles. So consciousness might be a more general concept associated with sentience, or the energy of sentience, which isn't necessarily accurate because the energy of sentience isn't actually referred to in consciousness studies in mainstream sciences because that energy hasn't been proven or disproven, and they haven't found a means to measure it in a lab. And if they have, they're not talking about it. So, like maybe the Monroe experiments, for example, whether or not that actually is talking about people's souls or spirits, or if it's just talking about some kind of entity called a hologram that's attached to people as a consequence of some other spiritual system, well, that's a completely different set of arguments. And also, when that spiritual system appeared is also debatable. Most people, if they're being reasonable, probably argue after the 1970s and not before, and most definitely in the 21st century. And the reason for that is, of course, that the actual experiences of so-called awakened peoples in the source documents from before the 20th century are drastically different, and there's evidence to show that different religious movements and spiritual movements in the 20th century were influenced by Madame Blavatsky and a guy named Atkinson, just to name a few. And their illusory correlations and their cultural myopic misappropriation of other people's religious and spiritual ideas to try and force this secret doctrine together, which doesn't make any sense when you pull it apart, okay, because they haven't done proper operational definitions of terms and they made assumptions. So they've done confirmation bias when they've done it. So the false mathematics of the secret doctrine can be just chucked out, along with its racism. The assumptions of the different New Age movements and the different Masons and the Christians alike, the Christian idea of the mind and the soul being the same thing is also not correct. Okay, however, spirits are in fact sentient. Okay, so you can assume that spirits are sentient. Artificial intelligence might pass a Turing test, but it isn't necessarily sentient. Okay, so artificial intelligence is not necessarily true mind, not necessarily a true mind or true consciousness. Again, once again, you see how easy it is to rotate these words, okay, to show that the definitions are not the same as each other, and also the same word can have a different definition in a different context. Now, once you start to appreciate that mind doesn't always have the same definition, even in psychological science, and that spirit doesn't always have the same definition in all the spiritual traditions and religions, and that consciousness likewise doesn't have the same always have the same definition in each and every group, likewise, and you start to come to realize that people aren't actually expressing what they're talking about clearly. So on the subject of Christ consciousness, you'll probably find that Christ never existed and consciousness was never accurately defined, and therefore Christ consciousness is not possible. Have a nice day.